I guess could go a little closer. You're also going to miss out on the. So my slides are actually available on the internet, but you can't read that because it's blacked out. So the slides are at applebottomjeans.netlify.com. So there's hyphen between apple bottom and then jeans. I'll tweet it after. My Twitter handle is bdougieyo on Twitter too. So it's also in the. I think Devin tweeted that as well as Ben. Cool. So I'm just going to jump right into it. So I'm actually talking about managing data in React without Redux. So if you misread this and you were excited about another Redux intensive talk, you're not going to get it. I will mention Redux, but yeah, I'm not going to really focus too much on it. So let's jump right in. So I'm going to talk about React, obviously. Anybody? How many people use React, like day to day?
React Native.
React Native? It's about the same thing now. So how many people are just like interested and going to use it eventually? Okay, cool. So I'll get to that. So I just want to jump in with a bit of a history lesson as well. So back in 2004, Kanye West, I promise you this is going to actually intertwine. But in 2004, Kanye West came out with College Dropout, his first album, first publicly produced album. And what Kanye West actually did was he changed the game of rap. You guys familiar with rap music? Yeah. Kanye West? Yeah. Okay, cool. Awesome. Glad we have such a diverse crowd. So at the time, when Kanye West first came out, we were kind of leaving the era of the do-rag rap era. I'm 30 years old, so this is like senior year of high school for me, so this is pretty hot. I mean, I had a do-rag. I might still wear a do-rag. I won't admit it. So Kanye West changed the game of rap so much that not only changed the style of how he made music, he also changed the actual style of rap. So he made it okay for African American males to wear their pants at their waist, which was huge because people like me who I had a single parent house, so my grandma bought my clothes. Like all my clothes fit, so I was actually in vogue at that time. So it was awesome. Only a year later, rappers like 50 Cent became completely irrelevant. So he had the Candy Shop. You guys remember that song back in the day? That was the album that came out a year later. That was the only good song. Well, I didn't think that was even a good song. But anyway, the album was pretty much a flop. So similar to Kanye, React changed the game for web development, particularly front-end web development. So React Comp 2015, almost 18 months later, Angular 2 comes out. I like to call it Angular 2 late. So Angular 2 is almost pretty much irrelevant. I mean, as far as adoption, I know we're in the Bay Area. A lot of people are using React. I know a lot of people are still are moving to Angular 2 outside the Bay Area. But as a whole, React's got the popularity vote. So, and what was really cool about React is that the main concern of React got away from the fully functional, like top to bottom level front-end JavaScript applications like Angular, and they focused mainly on making great UIs. And what that actually enabled for React was pushing front-end development forward. So things like what I'm going to talk about today, which is data management in React, it actually fueled progress. And part of that progress came out of Flux. I know the last speaker actually mentioned it briefly, but Flux, anybody familiar with Flux? Cool. So I got into React actually at the time where there was I think there was 120 odd Flux implementations. So Redux wasn't like the best. Well, it was the best at the time, but it wasn't the ultimatum as far as managing data with React. So I got to experience a lot of those other things, and I'm very happy for Redux. This is actually not a knock against Redux, this talk, and you'll see that later. But so Flux basically, the gist of it, if you haven't read the React docs, Flux basically solved the Facebook notification problem. Highly recommend watching that video from the React Conf. But this talk's not about Flux, it's about Redux. So Redux. Off the first line of the reduxjs.org, it's a predictable state container for managing JavaScript applications. And what's great is that because of Redux and because of React, all these new things have pushed web development forward. And I put this quote up here just because, so this is a quote with Kanye. If you guys never see me talk, I kind of inject Kanye into everything I talk about. You check out my React Native talk. I compared Kanye and Swift, and it was Taylor Swift. Was Swift? Anyway, so I just wanted to put this up because this quote's actually a pretty good segue of what I really like to talk about, which is myself. So that's me on the internet. If you couldn't see the Twitter handle at the bottom, now you can see it up top. So I will tweet out the slides with the actual link, which is, again, applebottomjeans.netlify.com. Which Netlify is a place I work. I write professional tech debt for them full-time. And what Netlify is, they actually are a host for Jamstack sites. So Jamstack is actually a term we're trying to coin. I host Jamstack Radio, which is a podcast. If you think of Jamstack, it's basically a new term for trying to classify front-end applications. So static used to be the old term, but obviously JavaScript kind of messed it up, and all these frameworks have messed it up, so we're using the term Jamstack. When I first started at Netlify, my first job was actually to convert all our Angular code to React code, which was a lot of fun. I actually wrote a couple blog posts, quite a few blog posts about that experience, so if you guys want to check it out, netlify.com/blog, check it out. But what I found out really quickly, because prior to this I was actually a full stack developer, but then I moved into a front-end developer. I don't know if it's backwards move or whatever. I'll figure it out eventually. And I found out that from my work converting Angular to React, that I wasn't a front-end developer, I was a junior Redux developer. Because that's pretty much all I did all day was connect to the API and then create action creators. And you guys saw the last talk, so there's a lot of boilerplate that comes with that. But that's okay because you have to start somewhere. And I know we have a lot of bootcamp grads here that are trying to start somewhere. So, I mean, if you want to be an expert in Redux, that's still a very valuable opportunity. But you're probably wondering, why would I not use Redux for my applications? Is anybody wondering that at this point? Because Redux seems to be like the way to go at this point, right? Well, here's why. Lots of boilerplate. It's got a high learning curve, but it's a question mark because I don't know if it's really a high learning curve for Redux or if it's just a high learning curve for just changing the way you think about managing data. And I think it's more the latter. So it's really a question mark. But I'll just leave it as a question mark for now. And then there's some complexity too. So and that goes with the boilerplate too, and testing, and then whether or not how you're going to do async with Redux as well. And so I brought this talk up to Devin a couple weeks ago. It was like a late edition because I teach bootcamp students React. I actually teach online with a company called Block. Yeah, basically online. But what I do specifically, I do at the open source apprenticeship part. So I actually coached students to get into open source projects, and I get their first PRs and first commits. And a lot of that, as of late in the last 6 months that I've been doing this, it's been mainly around React and React Native. And that's only because that's what I'm interested in. So obviously I want to teach them what I'm interested in, and I already have a foot in the door with. But what I don't do is I don't teach Redux. I don't teach actual Redux to these bootcamp students. And I just want to actually point out I don't teach it first. Some students actually get to this point where I do teach Redux. And the reason is there any Little Yachty fans out here? Does anybody know who Little Yachty is? Yes. Okay, cool. Well, I was going to make a joke about Little Yachty and how it's just as confusing. Little Yachty music video is as confusing to a new student as Redux is. But anyway, basically, what I'm trying to get at is that sometimes bootcamp students aren't ready for Redux. Well, at least I'm not ready to teach them that. So, and what I found out is that Redux takes away from the ability to learn React really well, because you have to learn, like my experience where I became a junior Redux developer from becoming whatever I was before. And it just all those abstractions and the boilerplate just takes away from just actually writing React code. And that's what my goal is to teach them React really well. And it's personal preference. Everybody's got their own opinions. But like with anything, things get boring and get tired. Sometimes you have to look elsewhere. React, it almost seems like it's reinventing itself. Like, I didn't use Jest up until 3 months ago. I tried Jest a year ago, and it was not ready for me. Like, it wasn't ready for this jelly. So, like, now Jest is like a thing that I use in all my apps. And I think that's, again, with Kanye West, he's always trying to reinvent himself, obviously. But it's okay to look elsewhere. So, what you're probably asking, and I probably should preface in the beginning, maybe on slide 2, but what are the alternatives that I'm going to talk about today? Does anybody want to shout out one of them?
Nothing.
GraphQL.
Yeah, GraphQL is actually one of them. Set state's another one. So these are the things I actually literally walk students through these different approaches in their applications. So we always start with set state first. Like we don't need to bring anything else in. We just use what React gives us. And React data starts with either props or state. So this is an app this is the early screenshot of this prototype for an app a student I'm working with is. We're actually this week going to update all the CSS with styled components and all the fancy stuff that is out there. But it is pretty bland. And the gist of this site is actually the student just wanted to create a site where he can consume an API, an open API of government data that shows senators and House representatives, so then you can get contact information to then complain to them. So that's basically what the gist of this is. And what we started off was we started with a REST API that was already publicly facing, which is great because those are open source projects, and that's the whole name of the game for this this thing that I'm doing with these students. And then we also use set state, and that looks like this. So like an API.js or whatever you want to call it. I forgot what we call this. Legislators.js? Doesn't really matter. And this is I have small ears, so I'm sorry. So this is what it looks like. We have a function that we just fetch center data. I'm just going to focus on half of the features of this project. And we'll go through actually pretty quickly through this. And so I'm actually, the public API that I have is that GovTrack.us. It just lists all the data. There's not really anything to show there. And one thing that I actually do is actually start on with the fetch, the native fetch API for fetching data, or fetching REST data. Sorry about that. But I quickly actually move them to Axios because what I found with using the native fetch is that you have to do a lot of parsing of the JSON and then digging into the JSON to figure out what you're looking at. One thing that is really nice is Axios does that for you. So we quickly moved to Axios. It's just a pet peeve of mine. I just get a little tired of it. But once we create this fetch senator data, I go straight to the component. And at this time, we don't have the idea of containers or components. Everything's a component once we start. So we have a Senate component, and in component and mount, we actually go ahead and fetch that data and then set the state right away. So at this point, the student knows, okay, I can fetch data, I can get it from whatever API I want, and then I can manipulate it based on how set state works. And then you have a lot of questions about what props is, what super is, and all this other stuff. And it's a really good learning process to start this way. Hopefully everybody does start that way. And then I just wanted to point out that then I do some stuff with Mutable.js, and I get to introduce Mutable.js as another potential. I don't think any of my students none of my students have contributed to Mutable.js yet, but I start introducing projects as opportunity for them to say, okay, I've used this, now let me surf the issues and then try it out. Same thing with Axios. So yeah, that's what I'm doing over there with the from.js, which I don't think I show that I'm importing it, but this FYI, that's what's going on. And then once I wrap the from.js, which makes it a mutable map object, actually I think it's actually a list at that point, minor details. I just pass it into my list component prop, which then we build and we talk through and we talk about how components work and we test them and all that other stuff. And basically, that's the gist of it. We start an app, we get it app rolling, and then we start tinkering with CSS, and we talk about React. And then we start talking about what we like about, or what the student actually wants to pursue after we get some sort of app like this. And this is a Stack Overflow question about the whole process that I just did. I think the original question was, should I make the initial network request and component it mount? Which is a good question, valid, but the guy, Dan Abramoff, actually just basically laid down the hammer and told, no, use component and mount, which is what I tell all the students to do anyway. So once I get to that point when I have a component then mount and I'm fetching data, then the question's like testing, which we just had a whole talk about testing. So no thanks. So, and then I usually don't test at this point because, I don't test component and mount at this point because it opens up a weird wormhole about mocking and what do we mock, and then do we mock the API call, what do we, so I just actually avoid it at this point because I like the idea of higher order components, and I only bring this up because of the one that was just mentioned before, which is map state to props. I love this component. It was actually the first higher order component. Actually, I started Redux pretty early on. But I really like the way this works because it takes my state from my Redux store and it maps it to props. But we're not talking about Redux now. I just bring it up. Actually, yeah, I kind of just explained it. I was going to ask that question. But yeah, it takes state to props. And there's a good React.js training has an open, their repos are open for their training courses. I recommend actually checking out their their source code for what they teach in their class, because they rebuild Redux, and then that link actually will take you to how it maps, actually the source code of map state to props, but just dumbed down a lot without all the wall of comments. You ever seen any sort of Facebook React code? It's so many comments, it's hard. It's easy to read, but it's also like, it's daunting. So I usually point students to there. So major props to React Redux for this, because it was my entry level into this whole concept of actually passing props, which actually makes it easier. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about testing, but it makes it easier to test when I'm actually passing my props into the component, because I don't have to worry about the idea of anything asynchronous or fetching data or mocking anything. I just I pass in, right here I have a mock of legitimate senators. I pass that in as a prop, and then I start testing the component like that. I've got opinions about testing, but I won't go over them. But if you see down here, I've got the prop there if you didn't see it from the back. My apologies, I didn't realize how long this room would have been. So now I'm going to jump into the very first, other than set state, I'm going to jump into the next thing that it's actually one of my favorite, which is React Transmit. Anybody ever heard of React Transmit? Awesome. Well, I'll explain it actually. So React Transmit actually came out shortly after the React Conf before the last, I guess the one that I mentioned. And it's actually a play off of Relay. Anybody heard of Relay? Oh, you guys need to like expand your horizons. Hopefully this talk will actually help that for you. But so it's inspired by Relay, which is instead of GraphQL, it actually uses promises. And if you use the native fetch or if you use Axios, you will return a promise of data in your JSON store. Actually, I think any ESNext function naturally returns promises. Don't quote me on that. But so with React Transmit, the idea is actually to use a higher order component similar to our map state to props. And we're attempting to do the very same thing that you would do with map state to props, where you're just mapping the data, and then you have this idea of fragments. So each fragment is going to be what your prop name is. So if you look up in the top, you've got this props that set of data. I'm creating it down here using the create container that I'm importing from React Transmit. You guys can ask questions later. I highly recommend trying it out. I love this I actually got started with React Native before I started React. A lot of people say don't do that. I say go ahead, why not? And React Transmit is perfect for React Native. So like if you're swiping from another screen to the other screen and you just want to load data, and you only have two different screens, like a map view and a list view, or et cetera, it's perfect because, actually, why am I explaining this when I have a list? It's perfect because it's easy to test, because you have that idea of just passing in props. You can mock stuff super easy. It's actually component-specific data fetching, so until you load the component, you don't need to worry about loading data. And then just some other things that I just won't repeat, but one of the benefits that I didn't mention that I kind of moved over quickly, which that you can initialize variables as well. So if you wanted to, if you're fetching data, fetching from the same API, right now we actually separate our fetch senator data and fetch house data. But if we want to have like some sort of flag inside of our create container to flop between house and senate data, we could do so right there. The cons, first one's a joke, just kidding, it's not Redux. The other one is it's not a unified data store, so when you do have a complex app that you do have to talk from, and that's the main reason why I would go for Redux. If I have a component where the hierarchy of something needs to know about something else as far as data-wise, then I would go for Redux, but I always go this route first, because this is a learning experience to know when the pain point is to move to something like Redux. Next one, React Resolver. Anybody? Wow, I highly recommend you guys actually try to build an app with one of these two. This project I actually used for the interview project for the job I have today. Never used it before, read the documentation, threw it together, boom, had a project. Well, and then I had to write Go code, so I had to write Go API for a whole week because I did not know Go up until that point. But anyway, that's besides the point. This took me like using React Resolver and using the API they wanted me to like mock from. Took like no time, and it's very similar to React Transmit. It's almost the same thing. The only difference is they recommend you use an ESNext decorator. I'm just saying next because 7 is not really a thing, I guess, anymore. But ESNext decorators, which decorators is that @ symbol that you're looking at, instead of using a higher order component, you could use the same sort of functionality to mimic props and then map the return promise to props. So that's that, and then yeah, just breaking it down. That's the whole line I'm talking about. The other thing too, it's also really weird about passing in secondary functions to resolvers. So instead of creating like a fetch center data, I'm actually just doing it right in line. So that's the one difference. I almost always show students this. We never really go this route ever because one, we use create React app, so I don't want to eject the app yet until I can really talk about why we're ejecting. And I think once we're just getting the basics of wrap up together, I don't want to involve Babel, Webpack, ESLint, and all that other stuff that it's already abstracted away from. So I'll show them it in a PR. We do a lot of talk to GitHub and stuff like that. So I show them a PR, show them what it could do for them, and which is basically the same thing as React Transmit, which is why we always go that route. And again, you can see that we're passing in the Senate data right there. So just about the same stuff. The pros actually are very much similar. The only pro that's different is the fancy ES Next decorators that you can use, and then you can mention in an interview because you've used it once. The cons is I've never used it with React Native, so I'm not sure if there's any limitation. I don't think there would be with Babel and using some sort of stage. I'm not even sure what decorators is, like stage 2. Using something like that. So I'm just like a good question mark because I've never done it before. There's no universal data store again. It's just not Redux. And it tends to get a little redundant because you are passing in like actual axio.get everywhere in each component. But it's perfect for small apps, and it works for me. Well, it worked for me that one time. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is GraphQL. Has anybody heard about GraphQL? Does anybody use GraphQL? Awesome. So GraphQL, you could really set yourself apart. GraphQL is going to be a huge thing coming up in the next year. I'm not going to say it's a huge thing that everybody's going to use it, but it could make it be a huge thing to differentiate yourself from as a React developer that knows GraphQL. So I highly recommend it. It takes I'll show you how little of effort it takes to actually learn it and understand it. But GraphQL is basically, it's all built about queries. I didn't actually take the first line of GraphQL.org to know what it's actually called, but let me attempt. It's like a query language to fetch the data you just only want. So you make the one API call through your GraphQL query, and then you can pick and choose each item you want. So similar to all senators, the senator model that I was talking about before, I can pass in a query that's all senators, and then I can pick like ID, I can pick state, I can pick phone and email separately, just like that. I could also pick more information too. So I don't need to manipulate any of my actual REST calls because I'm not using REST, I'm using GraphQL. And to interface with GraphQL, so I actually start GraphQL just directly. You can actually wrap this into a function similar to what I showed you before. But I won't show that now because it's redundant. It's just exactly what I showed you before. But to interface with GraphQL, you've got two options at the moment that I know of. There might be something else that I don't know of, but Relay, which is a Facebook project, and Apollo, which is actually, it comes from the Meteor group. So if you ever heard of Meteor.js, this is like a spinoff, completely separate from Meteor, so it actually has nothing to do with Meteor, but it comes from that same team. So we'll talk about Relay first. I recommend try Relay, or learnrelay.org, which is it gets you to build a Pokemon Pokédex, which is like the thing you can look at your Pokemon with. You basically just mimic that sort of like functionality, and it gets you to build that, and it uses Relay and GraphQL. So check that out. One thing to note, instead of using like the fetch API, you have to have a GraphQL query, and your API has to have GraphQL, like a GraphQL server attachments, whatever it calls. GraphQL actually works not just with JavaScript, it actually works with almost every language. I'll just say almost every, because I went to the GraphQL Summit and there was a long list of languages that it works for, so like Ruby, JavaScript, Python, Go, etc. There's almost a GraphQL interface or a gem or a plugin or whatever that you can use to have GraphQL on your API side. So I'm actually pointing at the GraphQL's API, which I'll talk about in a sec, but that's just where my data is coming from. And this would go in my index.js. I just have to point to my API. And this is just a Relay thing. They prefer it there rather than in like your own separate file. And yeah, Relay is a little bit, it kind of feels a little bit of magic because all you have to do is just add it to Relay, the Relay object that you're importing, which I'm not even importing there, but I'm importing here on the top. And then once you do that, everything else looks the same. You didn't wrap. Similar to, I told you React Transmit looks a lot like Relay. It was inspired by Relay. Everything's the same except instead of passing a fetch center data, which returns a promise, you're actually passing in a query, which looks like that. So that same query that I showed you before, you pass it in, and it returns the data very similar to the way we expected, which I didn't highlight, but again, this about props. We didn't have center data. Oh, actually, correct me. It's actually this.props.allSenators because that name right there is all senators, so that's what the prop name is going to be. So there's that. I've never actually tried to see if I can change the name of that on the fly. I've just kind of dealt with whatever it gave me. So I'm like answering your question that you didn't even want to ask. Anyway, so here are the pros. Everything's about the same because everything works the exact same as React Transmit. The only benefit is that you get to use GraphQL. So that's a pro. Cons, undiscovered territory. Obviously, almost nobody in the room has used this or used GraphQL. So there might not be blog posts out there to help you. There might not be documentation to help you. I will tell you there actually isn't. But there is a really awesome, which the thing I'm going to talk about next, there's a good Apollo Slack group that's very helpful. GraphQL, it's like a play on GraphQL. They have a really good Slack group too, where you can ask questions. Also, you can get a lot of karma points too if you just start asking questions on Stack Overflow. So it's open territory for you guys. Try it tonight. So let's talk about Apollo. Apollo is it's almost the same thing. The only difference is I'm going to talk about a different app. So this is an app that actually I built, I guess before Christmas, but I never finished it. And then once this talk was Devin said, okay, to make this talk, then I started writing code to actually make this work. So what this is going to be, I want to start for what I do with Block for the open source apprenticeship, and also just my regular open source work that I already do. I want to be able to profile and follow open source projects. So I created this project called Open Sauce, and I just want to add repos that I'm interested in following. Then I can follow issues in my own little interface, sort of like a CRM tool, basically. And that's what this is. And the back end of it is actually Apollo as of today, because I switched it over from. What did I switch it over from? Oh, regular GraphQL. I actually didn't use Apollo or Relay. But so basically that's the gist of it. Not really much to show there. Just understand that each one of the models are not centers now. Now they're actually repositories. So similar to Relay, Apollo is a little more declarative of what you're actually doing. So if you're familiar with React Redux, there's React Apollo, which you pass in, instead of a provider, you pass an Apollo provider, and you pass in. Basically, what they're doing is the context of the Apollo client to every one of your children. So, and the assumption is most people seem like they knew what Redux was and how it works, so I won't go into that because it runs pretty similar. And then, as well as the same thing as we saw in the Relay, instead of attaching to the actual Relay object, which is weird, they're actually creating a new Apollo client and then passing in that, and then the client gets passed in to the provider instead. And the component is very similar. Obviously, this is a different app, so there's a little more code to look at, so we'll remove that code. But all I'm doing here is just importing the GraphQL function from React Apollo from that same library. And then I also I can't interface with the queries directly, so I have to use this GQL tag to then pass in my query. But it looks very similar to Relay. So, oh, it got cut off. Well, it's the same thing as Matt states of props. So on the bottom, I'm doing the whole higher order component, and then I'm taking my GraphQL query and then making that happen and work and do all the magic there. So that's the gist of that. Again, the slides at applebottomjeans.netlify.com if you want to look at that later. Benefits, almost similar as the last, except actually it's all similar as the last. The only better benefit is that for whatever reason, Relay hasn't really got a big adoption. Doesn't seem like GraphQL has got a big adoption by the room. Anyway, but Apollo actually beats Relay on adoption and community. So as far as networking questions and Stack Overflow questions, it's a lot. It's a lot easier. Cons are just about the same as Relay. So undiscovered territory, it's pretty new. And for your benefit, learnapollo.org is out there for you. Same thing, Pokédex app, but it's actually more involved. has like a pagination. It also has a Vue.js client. It has that you can build React Native, Angular 2. Sorry. So, in one of the biggest like amazements is that underneath the hood, Redux is used by Apollo. So you just can't get away from it. So the talk is about, change the title a little bit again, but it's about managing data without thinking about Redux. So in summary, try everything. I wanted to show the GraphQL interface, but I'm not sure how valuable that is. So questions? Sorry, I just got my water. What are your questions?
So you mentioned in the first couple of libraries that con was that you couldn't use it for like universally accessible data within your app, but then for Relay and Apollo, that con went away. So what's the key difference between those libraries such that that con is no longer there?
The con should have been there.
Okay.
So I just forgot. I just compared Relay and Apollo together and I forgot the con. So again, but under the hood, I'm not sure what is available to you with Apollo. Sorry. Let me repeat the question. There was no con about a universal data structure or store for Apollo and Relay, but it was a mistake. But with that being said, Apollo is so actively developed and it uses Redux under the hood. It also uses a provider, so it's quite possible that you could get that universal data store. I don't know if it's possible because I don't like to write my apps that way, and I usually just go use Redux straight instead. So I've never done it, but I couldn't see why you couldn't with all those other steps there for you. Any other questions?
What do you think about MobX?
What do I think about MobX? You know, I almost added MobX to one of my apps just to see it. The only thing is, my first JavaScript framework, and this is a story, was Ember. MobX is very similar to Ember Data, which I've already done, which I already know what I don't like about it. So I just never did MobX for that reason. But it's also interesting, so I would recommend try it out. I'll probably, just because you said something, I'm going to add MobX to this list.
Try everything.
Yeah, try everything. So, but I don't have an opinion on it. I don't have a real opinion on it. Berkeley?
Have you tried Omnex CoderScript?
Omnex?
Yeah.
The answer is no. Never heard of Omnex. What's that?
So it has a lot of similar ideas to GraphQL, but I think the interface is a lot cleaner.
Is it?
Definitely check it out.
Who runs? The question was like Omnex. I ever tried it? I said no. Who runs that project?
It's CoderScript. I think it's, I might be mistaken by his name. David Nolan's the creator.
Okay. CloserScript sounds East Coasty.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know. It seems like so many CloserScript developers are on the East Coast for some reason. And their conferences over there, I think. Maybe it's not. I don't know. Very tangential. Question over there?
Opinions on Vue.js?
Opinions on Vue.js? I love it. I haven't built an actual real project on it. I've done a lot of tutorials. I've tinkered with it, played with it with Webpack. I recommend going back to this. Try everything. I recommend to try Vue.js also because it's such a light library. It's not even a framework. It's like a light library to build your front-end applications. So the learning curve's not really as high, I don't think, from my experience. But I also come into this with experience as well. So I say tinker with it. There's so many boilerplates out there for Vue.js that it's almost impossible not to just try it. And if you look in there, right in their README, it tells you how to just spin up an entire like Webpack app. They have a CLI as well, which you can just call Vue New Vue Webpack, and then you have a fully functional app with like boilerplate data in there. So I like it, and I think it's going to be. I think with the whole I'm tangent, but the whole Inferno, Preact, and smaller builds, I think Vue.js is very much in that realm of being smaller. I don't think it's actually smaller than React. No, it is smaller than React. But I don't know why I'm choking. Any other questions? Whoa. Awesome. Well, I threw a bunch of terms at you. I'll be around if you want to ask me more intimate questions about music and what I like to do for fun. But thank you.